Welcome to the Lloyd's List Shipping Podcast. I'm Tomer Raanan, Senior Reporter at Lloyd's List, and this week's podcast comes from New York and is courtesy of our sponsors, Lloyd's Register. On April 24th, US President Joe Biden signed into law a national security spending package that included substantial changes to the administration's authorities to impose sanctions and to investigate violations. One of the big ticket items for shipping is the Stop Harboring Iranian Petroleum Act, aka the SHIP Act, which instructs the president to impose sanctions on foreign ports, refineries, vessels, and shipping companies that knowingly process or carry Iranian oil and products. The broader legislation also includes provisions expanding sanctions to Chinese financial institutions that process significant financial transactions involving Iranian oil or UAVs, and extended the statute of limitations for sanctions violations from 5 to 10 years. In today's podcast, our guests Brian Maloney, partner in Seward and Kissel's Litigation and Investigations Group, and Claire Jungmann, Chief of Staff at advocacy group United Against Nuclear Iran, will walk us through the nuances of the new bill, how it fits in with the existing alphabet soup of U.S. sanctions authorities, and how it could impact maritime supply chains, especially in China, where most of Iran's oil is exported to. To start, we'll hear from Brian about the new authorities given to the president under the new legislation.
So, broadly speaking, when you think of sanctions, you can think of sanctions authorities as well as sanctions designations. And when it comes to the SHIP Act, there's a handful of new sanctions authorities that the president can now employ to impose sanctions on persons who are doing business in the oil trade with respect to Iran. Some of the categories in that legislation include persons who own or operate foreign ports if they permit a vessel to dock that is included on a sanctions list. So, in addition to designating the vessels themselves, now this legislation permits the president to look at owners or operators of ports that do business with those sanctioned persons. There are also new authorities with respect to vessel owners or operators that conduct ship-to-ship transfers, as well as owners or operators of refineries. So there are some significant additions here with respect to sanctions authorities that the president can use to designate persons.
I mean, it's enough that the ship is carrying Iranian oil and that the operators knew it. It doesn't have to be an SDN.
That's right. With respect to the new authorities for owners of foreign ports, there are two branches to that. They are in, I would say, sanctions jeopardy if they permit a vessel to dock that they know is on the list of specially designated nationals, or if they knowingly engage in some sort of significant transaction in Iranian petroleum. And, what we've said historically with respect to what is a significant transaction, that's what the director of OFAC says it is. So it comes down to what will the president determine on those things. It's a national security question, and it's something that the executive branch determines in the first instance.
Iran sanctions have been around for a while, and in a way it almost looks like this bill is sort of maybe prohibiting things that were already prohibited or in a way sanctionable. Where do you see this fit with the existing prohibitions?
Within the shipping industry, Iran has always been around as one of the key sanctions programs that actors in the shipping industry need to pay attention to. It's an extremely broad sanctions regime. It's effectively, an embargo for any and all activities by U.S. persons against Iran with specified exemptions. The SHIP Act is just another layer of, prohibitions that, U.S. persons and now foreign persons may need to pay attention to. Iran is also a program that has a fairly significant secondary sanctions component. So not only U.S. persons, but foreign subsidiaries that are owned and controlled by U.S. persons need to pay attention to the Iran sanctions regime. And that's particularly the case when it comes to the shipping industry and the oil sector.
Well, the expansion of the risk is to primarily the non-U.S. Entities and individuals, so constitutes basically an expansion of the secondary sanctions risk. Is that correct?
That's fair. Sometimes it can get a little bit confusing with the terminology, but I agree that, the new legislation is directed at foreign persons, and it's directed at activities of foreign persons related to Iranian oil. So it's not explicitly tied to, for example, use of the US dollar use of the banking system. And it begs the question, how far can Congress extend, its legislation extraterritorially? That's when you start to get into blocking statutes and counter sanctions regimes imposed by countries that are not the United States. The United States may be able to impose its view of the world, through legislation, but not all countries around the world will necessarily go along with that.
Going back to those limits, would these new authorities and sanctions be less consequential for entities or individuals who have limited or no exposure to the US dollar and financial system?
Yeah, I mean, where the rubber hits the road is kind of the limits of OFAC's enforcement on persons who don't touch the United States in any respect. So there are penalties in the SHIP Act. So for example, there's a provision that allows the president to prohibit vessels from docking at any port within the United States. But a lot of these vessels are not trading to the United States. Similarly, it refers back to the IEEPA and the blocking powers, but the blocking powers prohibit, transactions if the property is in the United States, if it comes within the United States. So you subject yourself to designation risk, which can be a black mark and cut you off from the Western world in terms of the Western banking system. But if those persons don't touch the Western banking system to begin with, that's where you see some limits to OFAC's authority.
At the very bottom of the bill, there's also the Iran-China Energy Sanctions Act of 2023. Basically deals with sanctions on Chinese and foreign financial institutions for transactions involving the purchase of Iranian oil, but also UAVs. Maybe just broadly, how do you see this impacting trade finance or financial institutions?
The provision in this legislation about that's directed at Chinese financial institutions or foreign financial institutions, it's another example of a trend that began in December of last year when there was an expansion in the Russia sanctions program to impose sanctions, secondary sanctions on foreign financial institutions that engage in efforts to support Russia's war effort against Ukraine. That was, very specifically directed at China. And there's a lot of concern, I think, in the marketplace from Chinese banks and other foreign financial institutions about how do we comply with these new sanctions authorities, because they're not just directed at, don't do business with someone on a list, but now they're directed at, don't conduct specific kinds of trade finance, don't work with specific counterparties that are engaged in supplying specific types of dual-use technologies that support Russia's war effort. And I think this legislation, with respect to Iran, it adds, I would say, a couple of new components that foreign financial institutions need to be aware of and complying with. Chinese financial institutions need to be careful that they're not purchasing petroleum products from Iran or involved in those sorts of transactions. And foreign financial institutions need to be aware that they can't be involved in the Iranian drone business. So I think it's a continual expansion of sanctions and trying to project U.S. sanctions towards foreign financial institutions.
The maritime industry is facing a pivotal challenge: decarbonising the existing fleet. To address this, Lloyd's Register has been evaluating what this means for shipping stakeholders. Lloyd's Register's Engine Retrofit Report provides a comprehensive overview of fleet and technology readiness to transition to alternative fuels, including methanol and ammonia. This report considers the primary regulatory drivers, shipyard retrofit capacity and capability, as well as the importance of human factors and training. You can download the report at www.lr.org/ERR.
There's less than a handful of organizations that track Iran's oil shipping and, by extension, the impact of sanctions as closely as New York-based monitoring group United Against Nuclear Iran, also known as UANI. I asked UANI's Chief of Staff Claire Youngman how she sees the new authorities impacting maritime supply chains and the so-called dark fleet ferrying Iranian oil. So Iran has been in the news lately, from the helicopter crash that killed President Ibrahim Raisi and the foreign minister, to the massive drone strike against Israel back in April. But there's also been an increased focus in Washington on Iran following the October 7 attacks. And recently Biden signed into law the SHIP Act that explicitly threatens sanctions on ports, refineries, ships and shipping companies involved in Iranian oil trades, the majority of which goes to China. So how does this new bill change the threat landscape for the oil supply chains facilitating this trade in your view?
So the SHIP Act, like you mentioned, is going to be targeting foreign entities that transport, process, refine, or deal in Iranian petroleum or petroleum products. And what's significant is that it allows the U.S. to impose visa and property blocking sanctions on these foreign people, which in turn they hope will curb Iran's ability to export its petroleum and limit its revenue stream, which is used for destabilizing activities in support of terrorism. But specifically, what the SHIP Act is looking at is targeting those Chinese companies involved in this type of activity. These entities now face risk of sanctions, like I said, including the visa bans and asset freezes if they're found to be engaging in these activities knowingly. Specifically, we do expect a change, hopefully significant, by tightening the sanctions and explicitly targeting the logistics and processing networks involved in Iranian petroleum. This act will hamper Iran's ability to export its oil. And again, like I said, reduce the revenue that it needs to fund its proxies and regional destabilization.
The president already had quite broad authority to impose sanctions prior to this measure. But do you think because this is sort of more targeted on Iran shipping, it'll have sort of a bigger impact and maybe lead to the actors to change their behavior? And also the bill gives the president 180 days to start imposing sanctions. This comes just before the election in November. Do you expect to see a fresh wave of designations at the end of that period? And how much of the implementation of this bill do you think is contingent on who is sitting in the White House and what their foreign policy goals are?
Yeah, so I think it's difficult to predict exact behaviors, but the increased risk of sanctions might deter some refineries and teapots from continuing to process Iranian oil, but ultimately the effectiveness of this deterrent will depend on the enforcement of the sanction and, application of the sanctions. So, I think we're clearly seeing an interest from Congress to, in the legislative branches to curb Iran's oil exports. And while we've seen an increase in sanctions from the administration, how much they will actually, use this bill and implement it, is just unknown at this point. But the actual passing of it hopefully will deter some refineries and teapots from their continued involvement due to the heightened risk of sanctions.
You've mentioned that there's been more appetite in Congress for Iran sanctions, and I think it's generally fair to say that that's been a change in attitude across the U.S. government. The SHIP Act was originally introduced last year before October 7, but there's definitely been a renewed focus by legislators and OFAC since. We've seen, I think by April there were 29 tankers and LPG carriers sanctions for Iran links, which was more than all of 2023. How do you see this sea change in Washington?
Yeah, so something obviously UANI, United Against Nuclear Iran, has been working on for years is drawing attention to the fact that Iranian oil exports generate revenue for them. It's the largest source of revenue for them, which in turn is used for funding their terrorist proxies. That's a message we've been trying to get out for years, and I think we were able to get that message across to Congress, which is part of why that bill was introduced. And then I think following the events of October 7th, there's obviously been a shift in mood with more in Congress recognizing that and wanting to take action here. And the passage of the SHIP Act in the House and in the Senate clearly reflects this change. And I think, we are finally seeing the rest of the administration wake up to what happened and wake up to the fact that this is what is funding Iran's activities. So we are seeing more sanctions, like you said, but, there's still more to be done. By the time they started implementing sanctions, the Ghost fleet was up to 300 and something vessels. While like you said, 29 have been targeted. That and that's great. But for every vessel targeted, Iran is still looking to acquire new vessels to add to the Ghost Fleet. So, it's a continuous process that needs to be worked on to fully address this activity. And I think there needs to be a more comprehensive way to approach this, not just one vessel here or there or 10 vessels here or there. We need to look at the problem more comprehensively and make a plan on how to actively target the oil exports.
Have you noticed any, I know we've spoken in April about this, but we're towards the end of May, and I think you said that the new blocking sanctions might have an impact on, or you're starting to see an impact of the blocking sanctions on oil exports. What is it looking now through May?
I think May is still consistent with what we saw last month. So, I think, like I said, for every vessel that's designated, Iran is adding one or two more here and there. So they're still able to get around it. And they're constantly coming up with new tactics to attempt to evade the sanctions. So I think the SHIP Act, once it takes effect, will help decrease some of the oil exports. Because like I said, I think it will, some refiners and teapots will just steer clear because of that heightened risk, at least to start, as they kind of feel out whether or not the administration is going to enforce the sanctions. But I think we're still waiting to kind of see the impact of the recent designations. As of now, the monthly oil exports haven't significantly changed.
That's it for today. Thanks again to our sponsors, Lloyd's Register, and we'll see you back next week.